Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode. You might not think of New York City as a garden, yet at one time one of the most famous gardens on the continent bloomed where today some of the city's most famous buildings stand. It was the life's work of a genius physician who happened to be at the center of one of the most famous events in American history, the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. You might never have heard of David Hosack, but he deserves to be remembered, as does the now forgotten place where they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. I do my research online, and there's always a risk to that, even though I use a VPN. I'll sign up for a newsletter that's relevant to something that I'm working on, and bam, the spam starts coming in. Or I research something, and all of a sudden I start getting solicitations for services or products that I was never interested in and never asked for. It is simply a modern reality that there are these data brokers, and they are out there collecting, aggregating, and trading your personal information without you knowing anything about it. Every single click that you make online potentially leaves you open to scams, threats to your privacy, and shadow profiles where information pirates try to manipulate your buying habits or politics. And your personal information is not a story that you want to include pirates. But there are laws to protect you that can force these data brokers to remove information that you don't want out there. But the problem is you have to know who has your information and how to contact them and what to say. And that can take years if you do it yourself. I mean, who knows how to do that? Well, Incogni does, and thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode. Incogni is a automatic data removal tool, and it was so easy to use, I just signed up, and they went to work for me. They figured out who had my data, and they forced those data brokers to remove my personal information. I signed up for Incogni back in September, and they went to work right away, sending out removal requests to 75 data brokers. And now my personal information has been removed from 47 sites, and I've been added to 23 suppression lists, meaning that the data broker will no longer collect, trade, or store information about me. And Incogni keeps me regularly updated about the removal requests that are still in progress. And I can already see the reduction in spam and unwanted emails and texts. So Pocky hates these data brokers too, don't you? So what do? You go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy, use the code thehistoryguy to get a screaming deal of 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy, use the code thehistoryguy, or click the link in the description and get them to take our personal information off the market. David Hosack was born in 1769 in New York City to Alexander Hosack, a Scotsman who immigrated to fight in the French and Indian War, and Jane Arden. When he was 7, the American Revolution began, and New York was occupied by the British and kept under hellish martial law until the British finally pulled out in 1783. Far from the urban city we know today, the population of New York was only around 25,000 people in 1776. The Manhattan that Hosack knew was still largely wild, much of it undeveloped. Hosack was educated at Columbia College, which was called King's College before independence. He became enamored of the study of medicine, a field that was still poorly understood in an era before germ theory, when cities were regularly struck by epidemics of diseases such as yellow fever. While the medieval term humors was falling out of use, the idea of keeping bodily substances in a careful balance still dominated medical thinking. Bloodletting was a common tactic for fever, which people were thought to be suffering from an excess of blood. The study of specifics, medicines that would treat specific illnesses instead of the body's balance, was still young, and medicines were primarily derived from plants and other natural sources. An especially effective medicine was Peruvian bark from several species of cinchona trees from the Andes, used to treat malaria. It naturally contains quinine. Hosack dedicated himself to the work and studied under Benjamin Rush, physician and signatory to the Declaration of Independence. At 23, he sailed to Europe to study at the University of Edinburgh, where he began his study of medical botany. In Europe, he discovered botanical gardens, which did not exist in the still provincial United States. Humans understood the medicinal value of plants even in prehistory. Theophrastus, an ancient Greek philosopher called the father of botany, wrote 2 treatises on plants and cultivated a large garden, which he left to the Athenian Lyceum for educational purposes. Gardens of interesting and useful plants for study were grown by ancient cultures all over the world, in Greece, but also in Mexico, China, and Egypt. Carefully researched texts on pharmaceutical botany were produced in China from around 2,300 years ago, and the study of botany flourished during the Islamic Renaissance. The invention of movable type saw an explosion in the production of herbals in Europe, which were lists of medicinal plants with woodcut illustrations and descriptions of their properties or virtues. Almost universally, the study of plants was a branch of medicine. In a modern sense, botanical gardens grew out of physic gardens, which aimed to cultivate plants for medicinal use. While physic gardens are known from ancient Greece, they became common at monasteries following the decline of the Roman Empire. The monastic gardens contained a ortus for growing vegetables, an ortus medicus, which labeled medicinal plants, and a viridarium, or orchard. In the 15th century, Pope Nicholas V set aside part of the Vatican grounds for medicinal plants and the study of botany. It was the Renaissance that birthed true botanical gardens as a site for the growth and study of plants. These early gardens were connected to universities and championed by botany professors. These gardens originated in Italy, beginning with the Botanical Garden of Pisa in 1544, followed by the gardens at Padova, Firenze, and the universities of Pavia and Bologna. These kinds of gardens spread all over Europe by the 17th century, and the gardens gathered plants from Europe and further abroad. In the 18th century, Europeans built orangeries, so called because they were used to grow orange trees, which were heated to grow plants that needed warm climates. In 1793, Hosack visited the Brompton Botanic Garden in England, where he learned under the garden's founder, William Curtis. Curtis was so impressed with Hosack's drive that he nominated him as a foreign member of the natural history group, the Linnaean Society of London, named after Carl Linnaeus, who suggested and popularized the binomial nomenclature used to name species. Here, Hosack met the leading lights of botany, including James Edward Smith, who had purchased Linnaeus's extensive collections, and Sir Joseph Banks, who had examined plants all over the world on board Captain James Cook's Endeavour. He returned to America with a wealth of new knowledge and confidence. Within a year of his return, he was hired as Columbia College's new professor of botany. The following years were busy for Hosack. In 1797, he treated and saved Alexander Hamilton's son, Philip, using Peruvian bark. Hosack's wife died in childbirth along with his second child. His first had died at only 6 months old, and in 1798 he proposed founding a lying-in hospital in New York, where poor women could be offered proper maternity care. The hospital opened in 1799. He also became the professor of materia medica, the study of healing substances, at Columbia. He became a popular lecturer and a member of high society, becoming the personal physician of both the Hamiltons and Aaron Burr. He also began dreaming of an American botanical garden that could study the medicinal virtues of American plants. Shortly after saving Philip Hamilton's life, Hosack approached Columbia University's president and trustees asking for a botanical garden. They granted him £300 annually for the undertaking, but the college was unable to provide the funds thanks to financial issues of its own. Hosack also appealed unsuccessfully to the New York legislature for funds. Hosack finally decided that he wouldn't find support for the garden elsewhere and purchased land from the Corporation of the City of New York with his own funds, beginning on September 1st, 1801. The land he bought was still well outside the city of New York, in the countryside of Manhattan. Today that land lies just beneath 48th Street. Ultimately, Hosack paid around $4,800 for the property of about 20 acres, or about $125,000 in 2023 dollars, adjusted for inflation. In November of 1801, Hosack was called to the home of Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law, Angelica Church. Philip Hamilton lay mortally wounded after a duel with George Eaker over an insult Eaker had made against Alexander in a speech. When Alexander reached the house, he saw the severity of the injury. Hosack described the scene later. After determining Philip's wound was fatal, Hamilton instantly turned from the bed and, taking me by the hand, which he pressed with all the agony of grief, he exclaimed, in tones and manner that can never be effaced from memory, "Doctor, I despair." Hosack put most of his energies into his garden. He spent money liberally, hiring men to shape the land. They used gunpowder to blow up boulders, pulled up stumps, plowed fields, and dug wells. They built a 7-foot-tall stone wall around the property. Hosack planned to use the medicinal plant section to teach his students, just as he had learned from William Curtis. He also hoped to study various food crops and was even studying a kind of cotton native to Africa. Hosack also planted trees around the edges of the garden. After Hamilton moved out of the city to the Grange, he often stopped by Hosack's garden on his way home to get advice about his own garden. The garden became Hosack's obsession, even as he busied himself with private practice, working as a physician at a prison and working at the lying-in hospital he had helped found. In a public lecture at Columbia in 1803, he told listeners he planned to collect every known species native to North America. The speech led to positive reviews. The New York Evening Post lauded the first attempt of the kind in this country. The Post advocated for the government to buy the garden after it was finished. The garden took shape. In 1803, his workmen built a 60-foot-long, 20-foot-tall building with 7 arches filled with windows. The building would be heated with flues to help grow plants accustomed to warmer weather than Manhattan could offer. Hosack tapped into his network of botanical friends, and plants began arriving from all over the world. He decided to name the garden the Elgin Botanic Garden, after the town in Scotland where his father was born. Hosack's relationship with Hamilton's wasn't over. In July 1803, Aaron Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel over comments Hamilton had made at a party in March. It was customary to include a doctor at a duel, in case there were injuries, and Hamilton turned to Hosack. Burr agreed to bring Hosack, although he only wrote H and K in his letter to avoid implicating the doctor. Hosack and Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, joined Hamilton on the boat that crossed the river to the cliffs at Weehawken. Hosack remained by the shore, while the duelists walked into the brush. After hearing 2 shots, Pendleton cried out for Hosack, who ran to find Hamilton cradled in Pendleton's arms. Hosack said he would never forget Hamilton's countenance of death. "This is a mortal wound, doctor," Hamilton said. Hosack attempted to minister to Hamilton as they rode back to New York, but the injury was grave. Hosack did what he could, but he was certain the wound was fatal. Hamilton died the next day. Hosack testified before city authorities about the duel and wrote an account of what he had seen and done there. Hamilton died in debt, and his friends put together a subscription to settle those debts for his widow. Hosack bought 2 shares of $200. Despite Hamilton's death, Hosack remained friends with Burr, continued to correspond with Burr even after he was forced to flee the United States after being tried for treason. Hosack also attended to Burr's daughter, Theodosia. Hosack would help found the New York Historical Society 4 months later. He tried multiple times to get support from the state for Elgin, but the efforts continued to fall through. Instead of despairing, he chose to double down, knowing it could spell his financial ruin. Hosack decided to try to sell produce grown at the garden to cover the burgeoning costs. His garden had quickly collected an incredible wealth of world plants, including Arabian jasmine and Job's tears from Asia, tongue aloe and silver tree of South Africa, and the silvery cornelia from Crete. He loved his Japan rose for its splendid petals, along with orange and kumquat trees. He added hothouses on each end of the greenhouse, which were heated to near tropical temperatures, and in them he grew cinnamon, ginger, pineapple, mango, and even Arabian coffee tree. Among his rarest was a Japanese gold dust plant. He also had a wealth of American species, including the carnivorous roundleaf sundew. He brought in an assistant to help him to begin to find new medicinal virtues. Hosack put together a catalog of the many plants that he was growing at Elgin. He would send the catalog with requests for more plants, as an example of what he had to trade. His work also began to inspire more gardens. In 1805, a group pooled funds to launch a botanical garden connected to Harvard, and Benjamin Rush was lobbying for one in Philadelphia. But Elgin was struggling under financial woes. In 1809, Hosack sent another letter to the state legislature hoping for funds. He told them he was afraid he would have to abandon the garden altogether. A state committee recommended buying the garden, claiming the land will probably increase in value. The bill passed, but one assemblyman who didn't like the idea reopened debate, claiming that the plants couldn't be as valuable as Hosack claimed. The bill was then rejected. The failure did inspire multiple medical societies and men to speak in support of the garden. One supporter wrote that if we suffer this garden of Dr. Hosack's to sink, as sink it must, we give a decided advantage to every medical school over our own. In 1810, Hosack went to the legislature at Albany himself with a petition to save Elgin, signed by 68 prominent New Yorkers. While some spoke in support, others were less interested. An opinion piece in an Albany paper called botany the least useful of all the branches of learning. Perhaps Hosack's greatest supporter was his old friend DeWitt Clinton, who recommended buying the garden on the floor of the Senate. Finally, after years of pestering the government, a bill passed the Senate and the Assembly, and a lottery was ordered to raise money to buy the garden. State appraisers estimated the garden's value at $103,107, more than $2.5 million in 2023 dollars, adjusted for inflation. By then, the garden had around 2,000 species of plants. He planned on using the money from the purchase to help fund a multi-volume book dubbed Flora of North America. Unfortunately, the fight wasn't over. Opponents were moving against the purchase, and one opinion piece raged over the frippery of a botanic garden. The state slashed the estimate by $29,000, which would likely ruin any chance of Hosack's flora book. Hosack was forced to accept the lower estimate. When the state finally took over the garden, Hosack was shocked that they handed the garden over to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, deciding that to imitate the Garden of Plants in Paris would require too great an annual expenditure. He took a job at the college, and he was forced to leave his long-held position at Columbia. The garden was leased to a Michael Dennison in order to pay for the upkeep. The War of 1812 drew away public funds, and the college was soon bemoaning the financial burden of the garden. Professors complained that the best visitors seemed to be 24 or so cattle. The garden did produce some significant medical achievements, finding that boneset had similar properties to Peruvian bark and was much more plentiful. When Hosack visited Elgin in 1813, he was dismayed to find the garden in a dismal state, with many of his precious plants gone. Although New York has done herself great credit by the purchase of the Botanic Garden, Hosack bemoaned, she has made no provision for the support or improvement of it. In 1816, years after the state had taken over the garden, it still hadn't fully paid Hosack for it. Finally, Dennison was thrown out of the garden, but not before stealing and selling as many of the plants as he could get his hands on. While the garden floundered, Hosack was at least honored abroad when the Royal Society elected him a fellow. While he languished in the U.S., a French naturalist wrote that every learned man in Europe knows that Hosack is one of the most zealous promoters of sciences and arts in North America. On February 14th, 1818, the state finally settled its debt with Hosack. It had already promised the money to various creditors. In 1819, Columbia College got the legislature to remove most of its conditions on the Elgin land grant, and the college began selling what plant remained to rent the land out in a series of smaller leases. Glass and tiles from the once great greenhouse were stripped and sold. Hosack spent the next years working on civic projects like the New York Historical Society and the New York Horticultural Society. Played a prominent role in the celebrations when the Marquis de Lafayette visited the United States with his son in 1824. He never gave up his dream of taking Elgin back. After his wife died, he remarried the widow Magdalena Coster, who brought with her a sizable fortune from her deceased husband. Despite having money, Columbia refused to sell the land back to him. Instead, he bought and moved into a mansion at Hyde Park, where he built a conservatory to collect plants once again. Retired from his medical practice in 1834, and in December 1835, he suffered a stroke. He died on December 22nd. Elgin, the once impressive botanical garden, had withered away to nothing. Columbia College sold the land in hundreds of lots, and by 1870 it was covered in buildings. John D. Rockefeller leased 11 acres of what was once Elgin, and in 1931 began construction of an enormous project, which is today known as Rockefeller Center. Radio City Music Hall was built over the old conservatory and hothouses. And so Elgin is gone, and the wilds of Manhattan, where Hosack once collected his specimens, are now largely covered with asphalt and concrete. But his influence remains. His many public works helped to transform New York City into a center of culture and science, finally surpassing Philadelphia as the nation's preeminent city. His years of teaching medicine and botany trained hundreds of doctors and botanists to maintain the practice of scientific inquiry in America. He kept open channels of communication between European and American naturalists. He maintained correspondence with presidents and princes, and was a friend and close confidant of many men of the era of the Revolution, including Hamilton and Burr and Benjamin Rush. He even mentored Isaac Roosevelt, grandfather of FDR. And yet he is nearly forgotten today, and his magnificent garden buried beneath the sidewalks of New York City. But there is still a garden at Rockefeller Center. It's called the Channel Garden, and there is a plaque there in memory of David Hosack, botanist, physician, man of science, and citizen of the world. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.